Promise me you will never speak his name again. Those words landed like a verdict, short and absolute, and for a moment I could feel the air in the room change density, the way summer heat thickens before a storm. I heard them in the voice of a woman I had not spoken to in 10 years, a voice that still knew how to sound like a judge. 2 weeks after the funeral, sitting in the small office of an estate lawyer who wore an expression that told me he had read worse but was surprised anyway, I held a small envelope and a brass key cupped in my hands. The envelope had my name written in a hand I recognized without thinking, a slant that never softened, a capital letter that always leaned forward, as if rushing to the next sentence. He had left me an instruction and a puzzle. Inside the envelope there was a single line in black ink, and beneath it an address. Give half to the first person he hated. You must find them and hand them their share if you want full claim. The key was heavy and warm from being tucked away. I felt suddenly younger and terrified, an old fear and a strange possibility opening at once, like a wound and like a door. I had loved Leonard for nearly 20 years, and yet the word hated felt like a stone thrown through everything I thought I knew about him. I told myself I would go to the estate, open the drawers he had left, and follow whatever record he had set. I told myself that I would not be manipulated, that I would honor his last wishes, and that I would not let anyone else take what had been ours. I put the key into my pocket and decided I would leave that afternoon. The drive north was a slow rearrangement of memory. The city peeled away into small towns where gas stations had names carved into the wood above dented pumps, and where a wind with the smell of cut hay pushed the car from the highway toward the farm road. The key sat under my palm and transmitted a quiet weight every time I thought of the instruction. It felt wrong to be following a clause about hate, as if hate could be cataloged like a painting or a deed. The gate at the entrance to the property had Leonard's initials welded into iron and was flanked by 2 stone pillars topped with weathered spheres the color of old ivory. The road beyond was a ribbon of gravel lined by maples turning toward autumn. I remember the taste of cold metal on my tongue when I tested the mailbox number, the scrape of gravel under my tires like the soft voice of the place welcoming me. The first sight of the house pulled at something unnameable. The facade held the kind of quiet confidence that ages into silence rather than ruin. There was ivy climbing one corner and a water stain down one wall that looked for all the world like an old bruise. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and something floral from lilies by the porch. I stood at the threshold with the brass key pressed into the old lock, and, before turning it, I placed my hand against the weathered wood and felt the pulse of histories invisible beneath paint. Inside the house, his presence was the architecture of absence. The parlor smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. There were frames on the mantel with faces I could name by their smiles, a calendar with a corner torn off, and a clock that had stopped at 11:12. On a side table sat a small wooden box lined with green velvet. My fingers found it as if trained to the motion. Inside lay a leather-bound notebook, a slim laptop with a sticker I recognized from a gallery opening, and a spiral-bound packet of letters tied with twine. Each object carried a sensory signature. The notebook smelled of cedar and soap. The laptop keys were cool, with a faint grit beneath the spacebar. The envelope with letters had the texture of old stock and the faint impression of wax. I opened the laptop and found a single file named Open First for Ava. My hands paused over the keyboard. The screen light seemed to inhale and then breathe out his recorded voice. He looked older than in my memories, a hairline silvering at the temples, eyes that searched the camera like someone searching for a truth. He spoke in a voice that had always been a steadying presence, and now sounded like a rope thrown to someone in search of shore. He talked about mistakes and the necessity of actions taken in secret. He talked about an old debt and about a person he had once hated, before love and before the small mercies that had softened him. He said the person was not who I would expect.
He left instructions for finding documents in a safe in the study, and a cipher that only someone who had known him for 2 decades would understand. I closed the laptop, the weight of his last game heavy in the air, and for the first time since his funeral, I began to suspect that inheriting him would mean inheriting the catalog of his rancors. I had to tell someone, but who? At the attorney's office, Michael Rubin had spoken with the low, bureaucratic gravity of someone carrying other people's endings. I expected him to offer condolences. Instead, he offered a stack of printed pages and the kind of look that implied either a complicated joke or malpractice. We stood at the window of his office, watching rain thread itself across the glass. Michael spoke first and fast, the kind of cadence that leaves little room for argument. "There are clauses that are odd," he said. "We have to file notice to anyone who might be entitled. There may be challengers. You will need a claims process and discovery. The language forbids a unilateral sale until the conditions are met." I asked him whether Leonard had been ill, and he said yes, but the answer had the vagueness of someone reading a chart. "When did you last speak with him?" he asked, and his fingers tapped a time zone on a keyboard. 3 weeks ago, I said. We argued about painting schedules. He handed me a visitation list for the property and names I had not heard in years. There was a requirement that all potential heirs be notified, that any undisclosed debts be made public, and that any required transfers be supervised by the court until a suitable resolution could be reached. He said a word I had not expected. There will be contestations. The word fell like a stone into my mouth, sour and heavy. The reality of public scrutiny was a cold wind. I left the office feeling both furious and achingly private, like someone who had been asked to display her grief in a gallery for strangers to critique. Backstory of who I was crept in as I unpacked his things that first evening. I had been the sort of child who learned quickly how to hide a bruise with a joke. I grew up in a small coastal town where summers smelled of salt and motor oil, where my mother, Claire, scrubbed floors until dusk and told me that resilience was a family heirloom. I left home at 19 with a portfolio of charcoal drawings and a bus ticket to the city and never looked back. The city taught me to value light and scale, to trade the comfort of certainty for the patience of a blank canvas. I met Leonard at a gallery opening where he complained about a sculpture I liked. He was older, measured and guarded, a man with private stories folded into his pockets. We married quietly in the late autumn, a small ceremony of friends who smelled of pipe tobacco and coffee. Art practice paid in fits and starts. We had a studio on the second floor of a converted warehouse and a routine that was equal parts joy and small frustrations. He protected details I did not know how to guard, summoned lawyers for contracts I did not understand, and buried a past that I treated like an attic I did not need to open. When he fell ill, it was sudden and unarguable, and the last year of his life rearranged everything into hospital corridors and whispered medical opinions. The present now felt like a photograph of a place I had once known intimately. Colors all wrong and edges softened by distance. I still remember the sharpness of his hand when he insisted I look at the key and the envelope and promise, as if the promise itself was a map. Leonard had hated first could have been any number of names that flitted through his past. In the list of people to notify were 5 to 8 names I recognized in different ways. Ellis, the estate manager, who had been a caretaker for 30 years and wore his loyalty like a second skin. Sylvia Hawthorne, a distant cousin who ran a boutique energy consultancy, someone whose smile always suggested a calculation. Jonah Price, a contractor who had argued with Leonard over barn repairs and who might have reasons to claim a grievance. Maria Ortega, a former gallery director who had once accused Leonard of cultural appropriation and then reconciled publicly. Claire, my mother, whose relationship with Leonard had been a complicated lattice of gratitude and resentment. Marcus Winters, Leonard's estranged nephew who had been cut off years ago after a financial dispute. Officer Patel from the county sheriff's office, who had a straightforward knowledge of deeds and titles and often helped with procedural notices. Each name had texture. Ellis smelled always faintly of hay and tobacco. Sylvia's perfume suggested citrus and cold metal. Jonah's hands were calloused and smelled of oil. Maria talked in rotations and had a laugh that made her eyes water. Claire had a way of singing forward as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. Marcus arrived with a scowl and a story that had been rehearsed into solidity. These people would appear over the weeks to come, bringing their own versions of Leonard. The first confrontation came sooner than I expected. On the third morning at the estate, Ellis knocked at the door with the kind of timbre in his voice that was equal parts comfort and caution. He had been there longer than any of the others, and knew the barns and the walls like passages in his own hand. The scene in the kitchen unfurled into a series of exchanges that felt both tender and sharp. It began with questions, and then moved into inventory and distrust. The dialogue stretched, patterning itself around suspicion and loyalty. I spoke first, my voice small and cautious. I asked Ellis about Leonard's last summer and whether he had spoken to him about this clause. Ellis answered slowly, his words like slow oats. We argued temperately about the logistics of the will. Marcus arrived and immediately set the tone with a sharp accusation. Sylvia came later and spoke in measured sentences that cut like glass. Jonah accused the house of being a money pit and wanted to know about titles. Maria demanded access to the archives. Claire stood at the edge and said that she had warned Leonard about secrecy, and that secrecy always had a price. Officer Patel took notes and explained the process for contestation in a voice that was official but not cruel. There were 8 to 10 separate conversational turns in that kitchen, each one a stone cast into the quiet of the morning, each one exposing a seam
of motive. The air in the house seemed to lean in to listen. Sensory details anchored the conflict. The kitchen smelled of coffee gone cold and the faint metallic tang of a key left in a bowl by accident. The floorboard near the stove creaked with a memory of heavy footsteps. Ellis's jacket rasped when he crossed his arms. Marcus's phone screen flashed with messages that lit his face with blue. Sylvia's heels clicked on the tile like punctuation. Maria's scarf left a faint scent of jasmine on the banister. The sunlight through the slit of a window made dust motes turn like tiny planets in a slow orbit. Each sense layered over the other until the scene felt like a tapestry of small truths. I inserted the CTA here because I knew the moment to ask. If you were standing where I stood, would you hand half of what you had to someone you once hated? We all say we would be noble until the cost is immediate and personal. Write in the comments, I would do it, or I would not, and tell us in one sentence why. Your answers shape how we see choices made under pressure. People in this community have told me stories of forgiveness and stories of principled refusal. The most valuable part of telling these stories has been hearing how you would have acted, what you think of mercy when it costs everything, what you think of justice when it arrives alongside grief. I read every comment, and the conversations here have steered other families away from ruin and toward clarity. So tell us now what you would do and why, and then come back to find out what I discovered when I opened the safe. What I found in the study was a war room of a private life. There were maps pinned to cork, a ledger of invoices, a brown manila envelope labeled "Hate List" in block letters, and a small safe bolted into the floor. The safe required a combination that matched a date I knew from memory, the date we had moved into the city loft. Inside were photographs, legal affidavits, old letters, and a stack of VHS tapes labeled with years and place names. The hate list was both banal and monstrous. Leonard had catalogued slights like fossils, each with a date and a line explaining when and why the feeling had calcified. The first name on the list did not belong to a business rival or a distant politician. It belonged to a person he had known since childhood, someone named Peter Larkin, a boy who had stolen his first prize for a model ship and had never apologized. As trivial as that memory seemed, he wrote that the anger had nested and then re-emerged at points in his life to wound in ways that were disproportionate. He had also cross-referenced Peter with later events, with names like Jonah and Marcus linked as secondary enmities. The legal papers suggested that Leonard intended the clause to be both a test and an atonement. He wanted a public accounting of what hate had cost him and, by extension, what it might demand from those left behind. This was where the investigation shifted from domestic archaeology to fieldwork. I reached out to people who knew Peter, a man who had disappeared into the weave of towns and port cities. Maria remembered him from a gallery show where he had argued with Leonard about a sculpture and then left abruptly. Officer Patel ran searches through old public records and found a defunct address and a string of court filings in which Peter had been a witness to a fraud case decades earlier. Marcus had an old friend who claimed Peter had moved overseas. Sylvia found a shipping manifest that suggested a man of that name had worked in a dockyard run by a company that now had ties to an energy firm. Each lead was a new color in a map. Ellis said he had seen Peter decades ago at a supply store and that the man had looked like someone who had been beaten by time but not by purpose. The search involved phone calls, dusty municipal records, mailed certified letters, and a small bribe to a clerk whose eyes told me the bribe was entirely unnecessary, because the clerk had been paid by curiosity 1,000 times. Technical steps were necessary. There was a probate petition to amend the notice, certified mail receipts to file, affidavits of service to obtain. I sat across from Officer Patel in the small county office while she explained how the discovery phase would work and what constituted a legitimate contestation. She described in calm terms how a judge would oversee any contested transfer, how the trust provision could be interpreted, and what evidence could be used to show undue influence. It was bureaucratic and human at once, like a machine designed to translate grief into ledger entries. Meanwhile, I began to watch the tapes found in the safe. Leonard had recorded his reasoning in a series of videos that felt like a man making peace with a ledger of feelings. He spoke to the camera as if to me, sometimes in the cadence of a teacher and sometimes in the cadence of a man confessing in the dark. He said things that made me rethink the small cruelties I had tolerated and the ways we had both colluded in his silence. He talked about Peter and about how small acts of meanness had echoed into bigger decisions. He had arranged for certain sums to be placed in escrow for repairs and for the establishment of a foundation to preserve the land. He had also prepared a list of conditions under which the transfer of assets could occur, and he had anticipated that someone might try to litigate. One video ended with a laugh that sounded like a shaking of leaves. He said he wanted the person who had first been the object of his hate to feel the responsibility of it and to have compensation equal to the harm of being the scaffold of his bitterness. I had to decide whether I would track down Peter or whether I would try to navigate the legal path that might declare the clause void on grounds of capriciousness or vagueness. That decision was not merely practical, it was moral. The team that formed around me was an odd mix of loyalty and expertise. Ellis kept the fields and the stables in order and brought me coffee at dawn. Maria agreed to catalog Leonard's archives and to help with outreach to galleries that had exhibited his work. Jonah came on to repair the roof and in the process revealed a letter he had never given, a scrap that hinted at debts Leonard had paid on behalf of others. Claire, my mother, wrote me a letter that arrived folded and creased, saying that she would come, but that she might only make matters worse. Marcus offered a reluctant truce, bringing documents that proved he had been shut out of Leonard's accounts years ago, but now claimed no interest in money, only acknowledgement. Officer Patel stood as a measured legal presence, helping broker permits and official notices. Sylvia, whose calculations had a way of making enemies seem like investments, helped trace Peter through shipping registries. There were 8 people whose names wound through the months like colored threads, each participating in a concrete way. Their presences were sensory and storied. Ellis's boots left a dark arc of mud on the kitchen mat. Maria's catalog cards smelled faintly of dust and lemon. Jonah's hands always left a trace of sawdust on any surface he touched. Claire arrived smelling of lavender and house soap. Marcus always had an aftershave that suggested old money. Sylvia wore a scarf that left a whisper of citrus. Officer Patel's handwriting was precise and neat, a comfort when nothing else was.
A moment of tension arrived when the first legal challenge was filed by a distant relative who claimed the will was a fabrication. The courtroom was a small room with fluorescent lights and a judge whose face had the softness of a sweater left too long in the sun. The air smelled of coffee and the plastic of chairs warmed by bodies. The plaintiff argued that the clause about hate was ambiguous and that such an emotional instruction did not constitute a valid fiduciary directive. The defense, represented by an attorney with a razor tongue, countered that the testator had capacity when he signed and that his instructions were consistent with his stated wishes. The exchanges in that hearing were direct and tense. The judge asked hard questions about the nature of the clause and about whether it could be enforced without violating public policy. We presented testimony about Leonard's mental state and about the tangible ways he had arranged for the
estate to be honored. The plaintiff produced a doctor who suggested that Leonard had been impulsive. The judge took time to ask about precedents and to request legal memos on whether a gift to a person defined by an emotional state could be specific enough for a court. The hearing was a sequence of exhibits and arguments that felt at once dry and intimate. Afterward, we sat in the hallway with Ellis and Marcus and watched the judge's clerk file papers like the slow turning of a machine. The tension hung over us for days. Another peak of tension happened when we located Peter. The man who answered his name at a small waterfront hotel had a face like a map, with lines that suggested hard decisions and softer regrets. He smelled of diesel and lemon oil from the soap he used. He listened to our explanation with a look that could be read as bewilderment and then as recognition. Our first conversation with him was a slow unpeeling of memory and accusation, and then, unexpectedly, of remorse. There were paragraphs of exchanges, 8 to 10 turns long, where Peter described his life after the theft of a model ship as an adolescent, a theft he admitted to and then minimized. He spoke of how his small acts had been punished by bigger consequences, and how bitterness had collected like lichen on the edges of his life. He told a story of having his own family betrayed later by people in positions of trust, a story that was both a mirror and a divergence. In the end, he agreed to meet with a mediator and to listen to what Leonard had written. The sound of the agreement in that room felt like the unfastening of a knot. Technically, transferring assets required several steps. A trust amendment needed to be drafted and signed off by the trustee. A probate court had to approve any non-standard clause, and the escrow accounts had to be configured so that half the liquid assets would be dispersed upon confirmation of identity. We filed affidavits of service for Peter, certified letters were sent to last known addresses, and a forensic accountant was engaged to inventory Leonard's holdings, including bank accounts, brokerage assets, and a small portfolio of mineral rights. The mineral rights were a surprise. In a file tucked behind bills, I found a map that suggested exploration had revealed a small deposit of shale with potential for commercial interest. We had to hire a geologist to verify the claims, and an energy firm sent representatives who wanted to talk numbers. The accountant explained in plain terms what liquid assets could be distributed and what needed to remain in trust for operations and conservation. Each technical step required signatures, notarizations, and a careful reading of terms, so that taxes, capital gains, and transfer fees would not erode the value designated for the person named in the clause. The procedure was bureaucratic and precise. The pivot changed loyalties came when a new video surfaced, one Leonard had recorded and labeled for both of you. In it, he addressed me and Peter together and spoke of a childhood incident he had never named publicly, an incident that had shaped both of them in ways that were invisible until now. He spoke of a summer of trespass and of a small ecosystem of cruelty where each had played a part. He expressed regret and responsibility and asked for reparations beyond money. The video was the emotional fulcrum for both of us. Watching it together in the old parlor with the rain on the windows, Peter and I shared a silence that was generative rather than accusatory. The cameras caught the way our faces softened, the way our breathing synchronized for a fraction of time. That night, we talked for hours about our shared memories and about what it meant to be asked to carry the burden of another man's instruction. The conversation had 8 to 10 clear exchanges, each one a bearing of interior weather. We spoke of forgiveness, of what restitution should look like, and of whether money could ever stand in for the slow work of making amends. The smell of the tea warmed our hands, and the hush of the house made our voices a small conspiratorial sound. Recruiting Peter to accept the terms was as much about building trust as about verifying identities and signatures. There was a scene on the porch where he signed papers while birds chattered and a light wind took leaves down the path. The scene included a small exchange with Ellis about barns and about the horses that would need stable care, a question from Maria about cataloging Leonard's letters for a foundation, and a joking aside from Jonah about the roof repair. There were sensory details everywhere: the grit of dust underfoot, the smell of hay, the warmth of sunlight on the porch rail, the rasp of paper being folded. Peter agreed to accept a structured payment that included a stewardship clause where half of the funds would be given to him, but with a portion designated for community programs he would volunteer to oversee. This arrangement softened the rawness of the clause and gave it a social function. He would receive immediate funds, but also would be asked to participate in the foundation Leonard had laid out for conservation and art education. The agreement transformed the clause from something punitive into an instrument of public good. The legal language required careful drafting so that Peter's role as a recipient was not equal to an absolute transfer of managerial control. The trustees would retain oversight while Peter would have a seat at the table. The confrontation that decided the future of the estate took place in the old stone barn turned community room. The opposing relatives arrived with documents and rhetoric. The plaintiff's lawyer produced a medical opinion that sought to cast doubt on Leonard's capacity. Marcus produced old correspondence showing he had been cut off and demanded recognition. Sylvia produced an alternative appraisal of the mineral map, suggesting it had little value. We countered with a ledger, a geologist's report, and a string of testimonies from people who had known Leonard in the years before his death. The dialogue in the barn rippled through 8 to 10 exchanges per critical beat, with interruptions and sputters and the occasional quiet moment where everyone's breath seemed to hold. In the end, the judge ruled that the clause, though unusual, was valid because it was specific enough to identify a living person and because Leonard had expressed his capacity in multiple signed affidavits. The judge also required that funds be placed into escrow with specific disbursement schedules and oversight clauses to prevent misuse. There was applause in the room that felt oddly ceremonial. After the ruling, the estate implemented Leonard's conditions. A foundation was seeded that would fund arts education and land stewardship. Half of the liquid assets went to Peter, who accepted in a complex and public way that included an apology and a commitment to community work. Marcus received recognition, and a small memorial fund was created in his name. Claire and I mended, not without difficulty, the long frayed threads between us. Ellis continued to care for the land and was appointed as facilities director for the foundation. Maria curated an exhibit of Leonard's later works that explored the dynamics of memory and hate. Sylvia brokered practical partnerships for the foundation's energy grants. Jonah oversaw restoration of the stables into a community workshop for restoration carpentry. Officer Patel helped with public notices and made sure the procedural record was clean. Each person played a concrete role in converting the clause from an odd legal puzzle into a functional program for good. The epilogue unfolds in 3 acts that mark time and transformation. 1 month later, there was a small ceremony at the barn. The air held autumn like a scent of orange rind and cool stone. Peter stood beside me as we read a plaque commemorating the foundation. The crowd was small, 60 people maybe, a mix of locals and city patrons. The spring of the foundation felt modest yet fiercely maintained. There were children who had come to see horses and to draw under the tutelage of volunteers. The plaque was installed, and Ellis fixed a loose hinge as the crowd lingered and talked around cups of coffee. I felt a tangible lightness, as if a ledger had been balanced. 3 months later, the foundation funded its first grant for a week of arts workshops for teenagers from the county. The workshops were held in a converted stable loft where the beams smelled faintly of varnish and old hay.
I watched kids smear charcoal across paper and saw the slow, sure arc of concentration on faces that had not had permission to play before. Peter taught one of the afternoons and told stories about a small ship and about how mistakes do not vanish. They are transformed if someone is willing to shape them. He had a new steadiness to him. He visited a community center and helped repair a damaged roof as part of a labor exchange program the foundation supported. The papers in the trust reflected careful accounting. The mineral rights produced a small stream of income that was partially reinvested into the conservation work and partially allocated to educational programming. We had hired a geologist and a fiduciary who reported quarterly. Their procedural notes were dry but exact and felt like scaffolding under our more fluid intentions. 6 months later, the estate had become a place people visited for retreats and for repair classes. The old studio on the second floor became a residency where 2 artists were in rotation, each paying modestly and each bringing a different air of work. I had painted 3 canvases I did not recognize at first. They were about weather and the shape of being asked to hand something over. Maria mounted a show that juxtaposed Leonard's late work with new pieces by residents. Claire taught a sewing circle where women mended garments and stories. The foundation had a modest board that included Peter, Ellis, and 2 city patrons who insisted on practical metrics. We produced a small annual report that listed outcomes, numbers served, and stories. The numbers mattered to donors. The stories mattered to me. In 6 months, I had learned that legacy is not only about money. It is about the use to which money is put and the conversations that are opened by the choices we make. The house felt inhabited again, not by ghosts, but by people moving through the business of repair, argument, and laughter. 2 episodes of tension remained for me as a private person. Once when Marcus came to visit and sat with me on the porch and asked whether Leonard had expected us to forgive easily. We had a conversation that lasted long into the evening with 8 to 10 turns where he admitted mistakes and asked for a small place in the trusteeship. I considered the request and set conditions that made sense, not as vengeance, but as prudence. Another moment of private tension was when a media outlet attempted to sensationalize the clause about hate and portrayed it as a cruel spectacle. We issued a calm statement and invited reporters to the foundation to see the tangible good being done, which diffused the curiosity with presence. The final practical steps to solidify the estate required technical process descriptions that are important to understand. We reconfigured the trust with a corporate trustee agreement, filed a notice of amendment with the probate court, and set aside escrow accounts in compliance with state uniform probate code. A forensic accountant reconciled books and prepared a statement of assets and liabilities, including the mineral rights that were subject to production reporting requirements. The foundation was registered as a 501c3 and a Memorandum of Understanding outlined partnership terms with local schools, including metrics for participation and reporting cycles. These processes ensured legal legitimacy and provided transparency for donors and stakeholders. My relationship with Peter remained tentative and real. We did not become friends overnight. We built a fragile partnership around concrete work. We spent afternoons leaning over plans for the community workshop, choosing paint colors, and deciding which tools to acquire first. There were long silences that did not feel awkward anymore. We had conversations in which both of us spoke and listened, 8 to 10 exchanges at times that allowed us to move from past grievances to future plans. He taught me how to negotiate with contractors without flinching. I taught him how to sit with someone who is grieving without trying to fix everything. In the end, what Leonard forced into the open was not merely a distribution of money, but an examination of how hate circulates and what it means to repair it. The foundation became a vehicle for turning an idiosyncratic instruction into sustained public good. People who had heard the headline and then spent an afternoon at the barn often left with the sense that something difficult had been done well. If this story moved you and you want to follow what happens next, please subscribe and join this community. We will continue to document the foundation, the artists in residence, and the small acts of repair that grow into programs. If you are involved in a family dispute or a complicated estate, consider consulting with a probate attorney who understands trusts and the interpretive nature of unusual clauses. Share your thoughts below and tell us how you would have handled a clause like this in your own family. I read every comment, and the conversations here have changed what this project became. Thank you for being part of this. The last thing I inherited was less a sum of money and more a set of decisions I had to live with. Choices that made clear that legacy is work not only of accounting but of attention. I kept the key from the first day, and on quiet mornings I hold it and think of how hate gathered dust and then became a ledger that we turned into something that could be tended. If you have a story about being asked to give what you would rather keep, tell us below. The place that was once forbidden became, improbably, the place where we learned how to begin again.